Oh, here we go. Hello, I'm John Reed, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to take a couple of minutes here, a minute or two, and wait for any stragglers, but we'll, we'll get up to speed in a minute. Hang in there. Okay, I think that's long enough. Hello again. Uh, Let me introduce myself. I'm John Reed, in print, John Shelton Reed. Um, I've got this new book I want to talk about, and I appreciate you being here to listen. Um, Let me tell you a bit about myself. I taught at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for 31 years. Uh, Mostly taught about the South, the American South. I've written exactly 24 books, most of them having to do with the South, one way or another. In 2011, LSU asked me to come there and give a series of lectures in Southern history, uh, which I did, and I talked about the French Quarter in the 1920s, and that became a book that LSU Press published called Dixie Bohemia. Um, Sometime later, when LSU decided they were going to do a series of books on New Orleans cocktails, Lee Ciolas, who was my editor on Dixie Bohemia, asked me if I'd be interested and said the Ramos Gin Fizz was available. So I wrote a proposal to do that, and LSU bought it, and sometime later, here we are. The Ramos Gin Fizz. This is a Ramos Gin Fizz glass. As you perhaps can see, it's exclusively at Roosevelt Bars, the Hotel Roosevelt. That's not true. Hotel Roosevelt tried to enforce a trademark for a while, but wasn't very successful in doing that. You may wonder what my credentials are for writing a book about a cocktail. Well, I've been going to New Orleans since 1968, my first visit. Been there dozens of times since as a tourist or conventioneer. When I was working on Dixie Bohemia, I got to live in the French Quarter on Burgundy Street for a couple of months while I was doing research on that. I tell people that New Orleans is my favorite city along with London, and I don't really know what the two cities have in common. I said that to somebody one time, and he said, well, they both drink too much and drive on the wrong side of the road. It's a thought. Um, anyway, I feel I'm pretty well acquainted with the history and the culture and the ambiance of the New Orleans that gave birth to the Ramos Gin Fizz. That doesn't make me a cocktail writer, I recognize. I have been a food writer. Four of those books I mentioned are about Southern food. And as for cocktails, though, well, I've drunk a good many and I have a pretty decent bar at home. And I've actually invented a couple that I'm not ashamed of, but I confess up front, this is my first venture in writing about a cocktail, and I hope it's a success. I guess you'll be the judge of that. Anyway, here is the book. It's a handsome volume. I think LSU did a great production job. If nothing else, you can flip through it and look at the pictures, of which there are a great many. Just for the record, this is Tennessee Williams, and that's Humphrey Bogart. Bring them up a little later. Uh, Today, I'm mostly going to talk about the history of the drink, which is about 1/3 of the book. The second third has to do with the drink's 9 ingredients and the techniques for making it. The last third are recipes for variations on the drink and related drinks. Uh, I'm going to talk about the history. As I said, if you want to ask questions about the ingredients of the recipes, you'll have a chance to at the end. Actually, you can ask them now. I think there's a chat option on your screen. I can't assume that anyone knows about the Ramos Gin Fizz. It used to be true. You could assume most people knew about it, but I can't assume that now. Let me read you a bit from the first page of the book. The Ramos Gin Fizz is a cocktail from New Orleans that includes, among other things, lemon and lime juice, egg white, cream, and orange flower water. Shaken properly, it becomes a foamy white concoction that the Kansas City Star called the Crescent City's most notable contribution to civilized tippling. London's Independent newspaper says the drink is, quote, one of the aristocrats of the cocktail world. And the Esquire drink book says men of sensitive character approach this drink with uncovered heads as they would a rare old wine. In 1895, when the drink was new on the scene, just a few years old, the New Orleans Times Democrat raved about its frothy delicacy, its quaint suggestion of fruit trees and summer odors, its evanescent flavors blending like the hues of the rainbow, its cool, delicious whiteness, its sweet caresses as it wafts like an angel down the joyous throat. The article concluded, all of these are things that no person can adequately describe. But that hasn't stopped people from trying, and I've got a list of a dozen or so attempts at describing the drink. Here are a few. Ramos Gin Fizz is like tangy liquid meringue with a gin hit, a foamy alcoholic orange creamsicle, ginny pillows of orange blossom delight, decadent floral smooth as silk, essence of angel feathers blended with whipped moonbeams, and it goes on. Some people do get carried away. But the drink is in the International Bartenders Association short list of unforgettables. And when the International Review of Food and Wine compiled a list of the world's great classic drinks, it was number one. The Ramos Gin Fizz also evokes the Crescent City's mythic past, although it was actually born in the unromantic business district of New Orleans across Canal Street from the French Quarter. And it was first served to ordinary New South businessmen, not planters or riverboat gamblers. It has an antebellum aura. Cocktail historian David Wondrich writes, to sip a Ramos Fizz on a hot day is to step into a sepia-toned world peopled with slim, brown-eyed beauties who smell of magnolias and freshly laundered linen, and tall, mustachioed gentlemen who never seem to work and will kill you if you ask them why. Someone once said that the Ramos is like New Orleans itself, sweet and sour, a thing of froth and fizz with an aroma of tropical fruit. As with the city, you may start out sipping it, but somehow your glass is empty before you know it, and you want another. Like most good things in New Orleans, the Ramos Fizz comes with a story. And I'll tell some of that story in a minute, but first let me talk a bit about how I did the research for this book. First of all, I had the question of how you pronounce the name. Looking around, I found people calling it Ramos and Ramos. It looks like it ought to be Ramos, ought to be Portuguese or Hispanic. But a lot of people saying Ramos. I didn't know, so I went to whitepages.com and asked it for all the Ramoses it could produce in New Orleans, and gave me a list of a couple of dozen. And only one of them had a name that wasn't something like Carlos or Juan. This was Carl Ramos, and I thought, well, that's probably my man, if anybody is. I called him up, cold called him, and sure enough, it was the great nephew of the Ramos who invented the Ramos Gin Fizz, and he said the family's always said Ramos, and that's good enough for me. So Ramos it is. Went to other sources besides White Pages, a lot of archived menus online, so you can see where it's been served and when and how. Cocktail recipe books, so you can look at changes and variations over the years. Court records, some things came up. Ramos was once prosecuted for violating the Sunday closing laws. Another time he was prosecuted for underreporting his receipts. Toward the end of his life, he was involved in a messy marital separation case. Carl Ramos, who I proud to call a friend now, went to the New Orleans courthouse and looked up that stuff for me and told me what was going on. So I had a research assistant there. I was blessed in that respect. Most important source, though, were archived newspapers. I mean, there are 3 great archives of newspapers online. And if you search them for Ramos Fizz, you find literally thousands of hits, thousands. And Yeah, I got time on my hands. I'm retired. I looked at all of them. So when you see a sentence like, by 1989, more than 100 California restaurants had paid to advertise their Ramos Fizz brunches, I know that because I looked at all those ads and counted them. Another, Ramos Fizz was a thing in California for a while in the 80s. Uh, Another sentence, the newspapers began to report its presence at meetings, fundraisers, civic club picnics, and especially at parties in people's homes. Suggested party menus and accounts of fancy social events mentioned the drink. Ads for grocery and liquor stores included recipes. That sentence there includes a lot of views of newspaper pages online. That's a, it's a blessing and a curse for the researcher these days. I called attention to the illustrations. There are a lot of them, and I think they're great, if I do say so myself. I had a lot of help there from a gentleman named Chris McMillian. Some of you may know he's a famous New Orleans bartender. He has a bar and restaurant called Rebel out on Carrollton Avenue. It's across the street from Burcatos, if you know that. Chris is a raconteur. He's an amateur historian. He collects all sorts of things, including pictures, many of which I used in the book. He was a valuable resource, and it was great to have his assistance. Check out Revel if you're in New Orleans and want a good drink. He also makes good hamburgers, I'm told. I haven't tried it yet, but I intend to. But now some of the story that I mentioned, I said it has a story. I'm going to tell it. It was invented by Henry Charles Ramos. Everybody called him Carl Ramos. Henry Charles Ramos, about 1890, there's a little imprecision there. Almost immediately, it was a great success, commercial success. By 1895, that is within 5 years, the Times Democrat said the Imperial Cabinet, that was his bar, was known, quote, among men of the world throughout the United States. In 1899, Leslie Weekly, a national magazine, reported that visitors to New Orleans who want to see the sights are always taken to H.C. Ramos's place, where patrons stand around the little room 3 deep, waiting for a chance to be served. By that time, Ramos was using the whites of 5,000 eggs a week, supplied by the largest hennery in the country, which implies that he was using some 13,000 bottles of gin a year. Almost from the beginning, he employed what he called shaker boys to do the menial labor of shaking his fizzes. In 1899, according to Leslie's, one was assigned to each of Ramos's 8 bartenders. Later, a platoon of shaker boys served all of the bartenders. The bartender would hand a drink to a shaker boy, who would shake it, pass it to the next, who would shake it and pass it on in turn. Success was great. It was so successful, it let him move around the corner to a place called the Stag Saloon. It had the longest bar in the city, a much more elegant place than the Imperial Cabinet. And the volume of business at the Stag, now I'm back to reading, the volume of business at the Stag is hard to imagine. Looking back, bartender Paul Alpuente told the Item newspaper it was often that we used as many as 8 or 10 cases of eggs a day. At 360 eggs to a case, that works out to hundreds of thousands of gin fizzes a year. The number of bartenders and shaker boys grew proportionately. Alpuente remembered 19 bartenders at carnival season. Ordinarily, there were 20 or so shaker boys that worked, but reportedly on Mardi Gras in 1915, there were 35. All of this under the eye of the imperturbable proprietor, with, as the Item newspaper recalled, his ruddy face and genial blue eyes sparkling behind silver-rimmed earbud spectacles, his snowy hair, his pure white shirt with a diamond in its bosom, his short, stout frame. Alderman Sidney Story, best known now as the namesake of Storyville, wrote in 1914, no beverage of recent years has drawn to itself more praise and attention than the Ramos Gin Fizz. The glories and reputation of this ambrosial drink have been sung the world over. In 1919, a writer in the Raleigh News and Observer in North Carolina claimed he had, quote, never met a much-traveled person of either sex who had not visited Ramos's place in New Orleans. The Ramos Fizz was so much a part of the national conversation that references to it didn't have to be explained. An Atlanta sports writer could quip in 1913 that the Georgia Tech's football team's offensive strength is as unknown as the component parts of a Ramos Gin Fizz. I could go on. It was a nationally known, famous. Ramos was famous, his bar was famous, the drink was famous. Over the years, it's been associated with a great many people. I have stories in the book about Humphrey Bogart, who I mentioned, Tennessee Williams, always had a Ramos Gin Fizz, it seemed, in his hands. Frank Sinatra was a devotee. Jim Morrison of the Doors, also favorite hangover cure. Walker Percy almost died from drinking a Ramos Fizz. I wrote about it. Said he was going to stick to bourbon from then on. He was allergic to egg whites, he discovered the hard way. Anaphylactic shock. Perhaps the most attention in the book to a famous person is paid to Huey Long, because there's a great story about Huey Long, and I'll read you an abbreviated version of that. Huey Long, you probably know, was the governor of Louisiana from 1928 to 1932, and after that, a U.S. senator. The adjective usually is to describe him as flamboyant. He famously loved the Ramos Fizz. I'm not reading it, I'm telling you. People joked he liked the ones at the Cadillac Bar in the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans so much that he had the airline highway from Baton Rouge to New Orleans built so he could get there from Baton Rouge 40 minutes faster. Anyway, there's a famous episode. You can watch this on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and search Huey Long Ramos Fizz, you will find it. Here I go. July 25th, 1935 was a great day in Ramos history. As the New York Times reported, at the Hotel New York in Manhattan, Long staged a one-man circus in the circular bar on the main floor, demonstrating to newspapermen, photographers, waiters, bartenders, and hotel guests how to make the celebrated New Orleans Ramos Gin Fizz. He explained to the crowd, "Well, gentlemen, I stopped in here at the bar yesterday. I've been on the water wagon for 18 months and wouldn't think of going off. Well, I saw a sign Ramos Gin Fizz. Wonder if I get the real thing here. I ordered one. Gentlemen, it was terrible. The second one tasted more terrible, and the third one tasted most terrible. I dashed off a telegram to Sam here to take the first plane up," and he introduced Sam Guarino, head bartender at the Roosevelt Hotel, who had flown in from New Orleans that morning. "Now, this here chap," he said, "knows how to make a Ramos Gin Fizz." He went on, "The Ramos Fizz is native to Louisiana. My grandpappy introduced it back in 1852. Long, quote, assisted with the mixing and distribution, posing for photographers with the shaker in hand. Repeating he was on the water wagon, he said, "I'm merely sampling this to make sure you gentlemen are getting the real thing." He continued sampling, raising what was, by one reporter's count, his fifth glass. He said, "And this, gentleman, is my gift to New York." Long was plainly positioning himself to run for president on a radical share of the wealth platform. It's not surprising his antics made nationwide news. Long and Guarino appeared on the cover of Business Week. And I got that picture here somewhere. Here we are at the cover of Business Week. Huey Long and Sam Guarino at the bar in the New Yorker Hotel. Cover photo. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram remarked that 37 years elapsed between the sinking of the Maine and Huey Long's illustrated lecture in New York. Both events will be shown in newsreel form at the Palace Theater tomorrow. The story lingered in the news for days with one twist after another. Some people were aghast that Huey's included vanilla in it. That's a lengthy discussion in the book about whether you should do that or not. One wire service story reported bartenders below the Mason-Dixon line are throwing up their hands in horror at the mere thought of vanilla in a gin fizz. The Chattanooga Daily Times rather said, men have been shot for less than what he has done. Crosstown Chattanooga News said Huey Long put vanilla in his alleged Ramos Fizz. That shows us what the man is like. Then Long's older brother, Julius, provoked another burst of stories when he said their grandfather never saw or made a Ramos Fizz. He said if Huey was going to make up stories about his relatives, he might as well claim credit for some great things like winning the Battle of New Orleans and the Mexican War. Meanwhile, bartenders across the country reported increased demand for the drink. Sam Guarino was booked for guest appearances at bars in Cincinnati, Louisville, Detroit, and Minneapolis. In his column for the New York Sun, H.I. Phillips wrote that Huey's demonstration had been one of the banner events of the summer, along with King George's Jubilee. The laughter stopped on September 10th when Long was assassinated in Baton Rouge. But a decade later, journalist and bon vivant Lucius Beebe wrote of Huey at the New Yorker, though there were those present who might condemn his brand of politics, there was no one who would even implicitly reproach either his virtuosity as a barkeep or his capacity as his own best customer. One of many stories about it, one of my favorites. I guess now I'm ready to take questions. As Henry Kissinger said once, I'll you have questions for my answers.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Uh, let's start by talking about the drink itself because you really didn't tell us about what goes in it, how it's made, why bartenders don't necessarily enjoy someone ordering it. Why don't you talk a little about the process?
Sure. I did list the ingredients: lemon and lime juice, egg white, heavy cream, orange flower water. Uh, it has 9 ingredients altogether. And in fact, if you say something about each of the ingredients, and you can, and I did, you've got a chapter chapter right there. Um, the that's one reason bartenders don't like to make it is it's a complicated drink with a lot of ingredients. The real reason most of them don't like it, though, is you have to shake it forever. People disagree about how long you have to shake it. As near as I can tell, at the Imperial Cabinet in the Stag, Ramos himself shook from 2 or 3 minutes, something like that. But after Prohibition, the legend began to grow, and people said it was always shaken for 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 12 minutes, even 20 minutes. People said the drink was shaken for. Well, that's absurd, uh, ridiculous. But personally, I go with Ramos's uh, 2 minutes, and 2 minutes can seem a very long time. I can tell you that if you don't have a shaker boy, just uh, get a workout there. But that seems to be plenty. And there are various fancy ways of shaking it. Put the ice in later, particularly without ice, then with, or with ice and then without. I'll talk about that a bit. A lot of technical issues there. But that's why bartenders don't like it. I was sitting in a bar in Covent Garden in my other favorite city, London, in April, and noticed on the mirror behind the bar, it was listing the drinks that they were available, and Ramos Gin Fizz was there. Unfortunately, I'd already ordered a Manhattan, uh, so when I noticed that, but I got to talking with the bartender, who was grateful that I hadn't ordered it, but he knew how to make one. He knew his cocktail history. Very well informed young man.
And the effort that goes into making the drink has even led to some inventions through the years. I think you have some of those
Oh yeah,
featured in the book.
yeah. There are various inventions. Some better than others. You could use a blender for that matter, but it produces a uniform texture, sort of like a milkshake. It's a very good drink, but it's not a Ramos Fizz. Uh, Here's a device invented for the purpose of shaking cocktails. It's by an Australian guy. It's got these 2 shakers and a hand crank. You can sit there and crank it and shake it as long as you want. Matter of fact, you can motorize it if you wanted to, and that does a pretty good job. But for the home bartender, I think wearing yourself out shaking a shaker is part of the mystique.
Well, there's actually a few things to note here. The Henry Ramos's birthday is actually tomorrow, and so they're at the International Hotel in New Orleans. They're having a celebration of the drink, and they're having a Ramos Gin Fizz competition. And one of the parts of the competition, it says, ambitious guests are invited to test their 12-minute shaker boy shaking skills. Uh,
Okay, well, 12 minutes. There you go.
So if
That's
you happen to be in New Orleans tomorrow, 6 p.m., the International House, they'll be celebrating the drink.
Oh man, I wish I could be there. Why don't you go down there? You're in Baton Rouge, right? Why don't you go down there and sell a few books?
It's also coincidentally last week was Louis Armstrong's birthday, and so reportedly it was his favorite drink as well. And so to add to the long list of devotees,
So Satchmo and Ramos had the same birthday, is that right?
they're about a week apart. I think one was
Oh,
the 4th and one is the 8th.
ah,
Well,
okay.
let me ask you on your last book dealing with Bohemian New Orleans in the French Quarter. Did you come across the drink in any of your research for that book, and how was it within that community? Was it popular within those
That's an interesting question. The answer is no, it was not, because I was writing about a time in the middle of Prohibition, which pretty much put an end to the Ramos Gin Fizz, even in his birthplace, even in New Orleans, because people who were drinking it speakeasies or at home in Prohibition, they were drinking to get drunk, and this is not a very efficient way to drink too much, you know. So they were getting Cuban grain alcohol off of fishing boats. They were getting cheap Canadian, getting good Canadian liquor and cheap imitation liquor. A variety of sources. You could buy uh, flavorings in little Italian grocery stores throughout the French Quarter and get some of this raw alcohol and mix up your own absinthe, which is licorice flavoring in this. Uh, so the people I was writing about, they drank a lot. I mean, alcohol started to function for them like marijuana did for a later generation of Bohemians. It was kind of a sign of membership and rite of passage and all the rest of that. They drank a lot, but what they drank was uh, higher caliber than the Ramos Gin Fizz. And one other thing, if you're drinking in a speakeasy, uh, a complicated drink like the Ramos Gin Fizz, it's harder to hide everything if there's a raid. You know, you got to put all this stuff away. So, great many reasons. People were nostalgic for it. I mean, one reviewer of a cocktail book said, you know, these cocktails are high potency stuff, and longing for the days of the Sazerac and the Ramos Gin Fizz and genteel drinks, not like this stuff. I guess the Hurricane is kind of the successor to the drinks of Prohibition. It's a heavy hitter, you know. But immediately on the repeal of Prohibition, in fact, before the repeal was formal, when the last state ratified the repeal, and this was weeks before repeal went into effect, people in New Orleans were drinking again, and the newspapers reported that the Sazerac and the Ramos Gin Fizz were the most common drinks ordered, and the Ramos Fizz actually outperformed the Sazerac. So it remained a memory. Uh, One other thing, during Prohibition, if you were lucky enough to be in Texas, you crossed the river to Nuevo Laredo, and the Cadillac Bar there was run by a guy who used to work for Henry Ramos. And it's advertised up front, home of the Ramos Gin Fizz. They kept doing it till the Roosevelt Hotel made them stop calling it that. But the Cadillac Bar was a destination, excuse me, for thirsty Texans and other people that found themselves in the vicinity. It was quite a place. I wrote about it. The granddaughter of the guy who ran it has written a book about it. She's a Texan, of
Yeah,
course.
it seems like in some ways it became as known. The Cadillac establishment became as well known for the Ramos Gin Fizz as almost some other places like the Roosevelt. It got a
Yeah.
lot of attention.
Well, it had you know, it and other places across the border, the various borders, the Vancouver Hotel, for example, and some bars in Europe. They had it all to themselves for the length of Prohibition. I mean, because people weren't drinking it in the States, not even illegally, just too much trouble, you know. Uh, so, yeah, Cadillac Bar was the most famous of these expatriate places, to be sure. It was quite a scene. I'm sure it was. Had monkeys and parrots in the parking lot, and he cooked New Orleans food, combination of New Orleans and Mexican food, and was gambling in the back room. It was quite a place. It lasted till about 2010. It passed out of the family uh, 1990 or so, but then Nuevo Laredo got a little too scary for most tourists to visit, so it and many other tourist attractions have closed down.
Well, you alluded to the distinction between the Ramos Gin Fizz and the what they were drinking in the say the Dixie your Bohemian crowd when your other book was set. Well, is there tell the uneducated in terms of is there some sort of class implications with this drink? Is it seen as you know is there a is am I
Yeah.
wrong to assume that there seems it's like a highbrow kind of drink?
Well, certainly in the years after repeal, you know, before Prohibition, it was, you know, the folks who were drinking it were they were businessmen, they were tourists, they were middle class, I think. I don't think it was ever a working man's drink. But in the 40s and 50s, it became a sort of glamorous drink. It got associated with Frank Sinatra in Las Vegas and this Humphrey Bogart movie. I mentioned his lady friend orders a Ramos Gin Fizz, and one critic says this signifies that she's a sophisticated, worldly, knowledgeable person, that she's drinking this classy drink. So it did have those connotations right up until right up until the Ramos Fizz and other classic cocktails passed out of favor, and that's another chapter in there. What happened when the baby boomers came along, and they well, we've got all these disco drinks, fern bar drinks, kind of naughty names, sex on the beach and the slippery nipple, and they're sweet vodka-based drinks. All the classic drinks kind of faded for a while. And then, coming back to it, cycles in these things. Starting in the 1990s, there was a classic cocktail revival in New Orleans, right in the thick of this. Uh, People started making their own bitters, squeezing their own fruit juices, seeking out obscure brands of liquor, including the Old Tom gin that ideally you use to make Ramos Fizz with. Uh, so, as I say, a lot of this book is history. The first third, at least, is history of the rise and fall and rise and fall and rise of the Ramos Gin Fizz.
Yeah, and the other thing, another great selling point about the book is you have what, about 15 different recipes in there, the different variations?
Yes, I do. Some of them are jokes. I mean, some of them of historical interest. I mean, I've got Huey Long's recipe, for example, which was printed in the Washington Post. It's bizarre, and I
Does it
surely not.
include vanilla?
Beg pardon?
Does it include vanilla?
Yes, it does. A lot of vanilla in it. Got the Cadillac Bar's recipe. Got the there was this thing in California in the 80s. All of a sudden, the California Ramos Fizz brunch became a thing, and it was part of sort of upper middle class California life. And I've got to think about it, just like the outdoor barbecue pit. If you're having a party, you make Ramos Fizzes. And there were not just parties with Ramos Fizzes, there were Ramos Fizz parties where you got people together in order to make Ramos Fizzes. And so recipes there were served at brunches. Um, there's a Ramos Fizz freeze recipe out of the San Francisco paper. Um, there, there was a situation there that, which was it? The San Francisco Examiner sent one of their crack investigative reporters around to uh, 10 bars in San Francisco and Marin County and sample assay their Ramos Fizzes, get the alcohol content. Well, none of the 10 fizzes sampled reached the level of 6%, which is what you get if you make it with Ramos's recipe. They're skimping on the gin. 2 of the 10 didn't have any gin at all, as far as could be determined. So, and apparently nobody noticed. So, somebody wants a non-alcoholic version, just make it and leave the gin out, and some unsophisticated palates won't be able to tell the difference. But I've got the one of those 2 recipes. One of those 2 restaurants, incidentally, was prosecuted because they printed the recipe on their uh, cocktail napkins, and they said it had gin in it, and it didn't. So they got it for that false advertising. I've got some fancy variations from, craft bartenders, just to show a range of possibilities. I don't entirely approve of this, but and I've discussed variations, some of which are just bizarre. But that, I guess, mixologists got to mix. I mean, and they certainly do. There's one recipe here that's my own recipe. It's the last one. Somebody observed once that a Ramos Gin Fizz has the same ingredients as French toast. So you just have to increase the egg white content a little. So I've got a recipe here for Ramos Gin French toast, which is actually pretty good. Pretty good. You've got a gin syrup that you pour over the top. Another way to have gin for breakfast.
Well, yeah, another way to that I like that. You talked about you shared a lot of great stories that you discovered along the way. Was there anything that was particularly shocking or surprising to you? What was the thing that took you aback the most?
Golly. Well, James, it's hard to say. One thing that impressed me greatly that I wouldn't have guessed is how international it is now. I mean, I went looking online for bar menus from around the world, and this craft bar craft cocktail business is international. So I'm finding Ramos Gin Fizzes in Singapore and Manila and Phuket, Thailand, and Slovenia, and Lord knows Western Europe, and just a couple of dozen countries. I can tell you where to get a Ramos Fizz if you go there. I had no idea. There's a place in Australia that claims it sells hundreds a week. That's kind of Ramos level quantity.
Well, when you were looking at these, doing this research online and these menus, was it still somehow associated with New Orleans, or has the drink transcended New Orleans?
I think I think New Orleans has kept it pretty well attached to itself. There was a moment there when the Californians were about to steal it. I mean, there was a recipe printed in some Canadian newspaper that said, "Here's a recipe from California. It gives a nice California sunny feel to a winter day," and it didn't mention New Orleans, because it said everybody in California is drinking this drink. Uh, so by that time, it lost its New Orleans connection. But many places that serve it mention on the menu that it's from New Orleans, and a lot of New Orleans themed restaurants offer it as one of the drinks at their bars, and hope you don't order it.
Yes, there's certainly a mystique about the city, and it seems like it's appealing to places around the world, and so they kind of incorporate when they have a jazz night, you can have this drink.
Yeah, I've got three quotations at the very beginning of the book, so uh, and I'll read to you. Uh, Victor Bernard, writing in the St. Louis Globe Democrat, said, "New Orleans is the city of Mardi Gras, oysters, Rockefeller, and the Ramos Gin Fizz." David Cohn, a book called New Orleans and Its Living Past. New Orleans is distinguished by superb cooking, an abominable climate, excellent manners, Creoles, gracious living, a widespread love of gambling, buoyant society, some of the best, also some of the worst architecture in the land, delicious odors, antique dealers with the gift for extemporaneous storytelling, mockingbirds, Mardi Gras, the dominance of the Catholic religion, fine needlework, and the Ramos Gin Fizz. Lee Allen, reporter, said New Orleans is certainly one of the most civilized cities in the United States, any town capable of producing shrimp or remoulade. Louis Armstrong and the Ramos Gin Fizz has nothing to apologize for. So, in many quarters, the title of this series is Iconic New Orleans Cocktails. Uh, we, I'm not crazy about that word iconic, but it certainly applies in this case. I mean, it's thrown about loosely, but in this case, it is an icon of New Orleans.
Yeah, I think you really could make the case if you had a pyramid, a hierarchy of iconic New Orleans cocktails, that this one might be right there at the top. The
Well,
Hurricane, might give it it's certainly achieved its some notoriety recently, but in terms of craft cocktails, it seems like the Ramos Gin Fizz
yeah,
is up there near the
the
pinnacle.
Sazerac is the only one to rival it, really, I think, or maybe the Hurricane. But Sazerac is, in fact, named by the state legislature as the official cocktail. Louisiana or New Orleans, I don't remember, but actually the manager of the Sazerac Bar at the Roosevelt Hotel said, really, the Sazerac says as an official cocktail, the Ramos Gin Fizz is better because it's all about, you can drink it all day long, kind of easygoing, laid back lifestyle. This is what New Orleans is all about.
Yeah.
I agree with them.
Yeah, gumbo and the Ramos Gin Fizz are the perfect metaphors for Louisiana and New Orleans in a lot of ways.
I think you're right.
Well, that it's been fascinating. What are you working on next?
Well, my late wife and I wrote a book back in 1996 called "A Thousand and One Things Everyone Should Know About the South." And I have a publisher who wants to bring out a revised and updated edition. And I thought, well, that won't be too hard. It's turning out to be a nightmare. Well, not a nightmare, a lot more work than I anticipated because so many things have changed since 1996. Updating that book is not quite as hard as starting over, but it's a lot more work than I anticipated. That's what I'm doing these days.
Oh, that sounds fascinating itself. Okay, well that's all we have. All the questions we had. Thank you for being here, and you want
Yeah,
to wrap things
James,
up?
one thing I know you'd like for me to mention is that there's a link in the comments section I gather that we'll let people buy this book for 40% off, and I hope some of our viewers will do that.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to everyone for tuning in today.